Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello and welcome back for Start the Week's autumn season. We begin with a special, a single guest and one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of modern letters. On Valentine's Day 1989, at the funeral of the writer Bruce Chatwin in London, word spread about something almost unbelievable. Iran's spiritual leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, had just ordered the murder of one of the guests, Salman Rushdie, for the crime of writing a novel, The Satanic Verses, which, despite being a fantasy fiction, Khomeini considered blasphemous. Salman Rushdie's life changed instantly and forever. Over the next decade he was on the run or in hiding, guarded by armed officers as assassins tried to hunt him down. He lived, he survived, he carried on writing, but he has not, until now, addressed directly the nightmare which overtook him. This story is very far from over. The effect of what has happened has had a big impact on free speech. Salman Rushdie's memoir is called Joseph Anton, and we'll explain why later. But let's start, Salman Rushdie, about talking about who you are. Where you come from. You come from a most unusual family in India, in Bombay.
Yes, my parents moved to Bombay, in fact, just a year before I was born. They were originally of Kashmiri extraction, although my father was from an old Delhi family. Mm-hmm. My mother and he initially lived there and then decided, as partition was approaching, that they didn't want to go to Pakistan. They were not religious. They didn't want to live in a religious state. They felt more Indian than Muslim, and so they thought they'd go to Bombay, which had a reputation, justifiably, as a place where communal violence did not happen. And I was born there a year later.
So the themes of religion and violence and so on were there from the start. You have been obsessed throughout your fiction by names, and mixing names up. And indeed, your own name, Rushdie, is a made-up name. It's a name that your father essentially invented as a homage to the philosopher Ibn Rushd.
Yes, well Ibn Rushd, known in the European tradition as Averroes, was the great translator and critic of Aristotle. And in many ways, the reason we have a lot of Aristotle is because of his Arabic translations, because a lot of the original Greek was lost and he was retranslated. Anyway, he was also a remarkable figure in medieval Islam, in the Spanish part of the Muslim Empire at that time, because he was a very progressive force. He was one of the people who was trying to break the power of the literalists, the people who said that the Quran could not be interpreted, could only be read literally.
So what a name to be under. And there's a wonderful passage which I'm going to ask you to read from your memoir.
At least, he told himself when the storm broke over his head, I'm going into this battle bearing the right name. From beyond the grave, his father had given him the flag under which he was ready to fight, the flag of Ibn Rushd, which stood for intellect, argument, analysis, and progress, for the freedom of philosophy and learning from the shackles of theology, for human reason and against blind faith, submission, acceptance, and stagnation.
So you come from this free-thinking, rather rebelliously, intellectually rebellious Bombay background.
Yes.
But early on, you are sent away to school, rugby school, and the snow, and there's an almost kind of Greyfriars world. I mean, at that stage, it's a pretty harsh and alienating and an odd world for an Indian boy to arrive in.
Was very difficult. I mean, I think I had never previously in my life thought of myself as alien. You know, and rugby was the place that made clear to me that I was other, that I was not like them. As a result, I wasn't particularly happy there.
When did you decide you wanted to be a novelist?
Oh, I think, well, according to my parents, I always said so. I don't remember saying this, but that's what they said I said. I think I never really had, the only other plan I ever remotely had was to be an actor. And when I was at Cambridge, I tried to do a bit of both. I wrote for the university paper, and I spent a lot of time in student dramatics. and eventually I think had the brains to realize that I probably shouldn't be an actor.
Well, who knows what would have happened if you had been, but you set off, and it's a long process becoming a successful writer, as it is for very many people. Meanwhile, you end up in an advertising agency. I have to say, one of the least likely things about you are some of the things that your successful jingles and so on at the advertising agency. Aero Chocolate, Delectabubble, and all of that. That was you.
That was me, yes. Irresistibubble, Adorabubble.
Yes.
Bus signs saying transporter bubble.
Yes. And cream cakes. Was the cream...
Yeah, Naughty But Nice, yeah. I mean, actually, the thing about Naughty But Nice is that when I wrote it and presented it to the cream cake client, he turned it down because he said, "You are saying that cream cakes make people fat." And I said, "Look, they know that. You should focus on the but nice."
Yeah.
He didn't buy it. And then I left the agency. Somebody else a year later sort of tarted it up and represented it and did a better job than me and sold it.
It's as I say, it's a very Salman Rushdie, best known for Naughty But Nice. It doesn't quite work. I'm leaping far ahead, but you say you had 7 great years when success bred success. Midnight's Children, Shame.
Yeah, when Midnight's Children was published, I had no understanding at all of the kind of popularity that it would have, and it changed my life. It made it possible for me to live as a writer, and more than financially, it reassured me that I was able to be what I wanted to be.
And your particular voice, people have compared it to magic realism in South America and so on. It seems to me to be not like that, really, but to have grown out of Indian traditions of storytelling. You have always had a fascination with fantasy, lists, perhaps the grotesque, and a long way away from the European naturalist tradition of novel writing.
Yeah, in India, first of all, you grow up in a world of wonderful tales. If you're, as a child, you have this incredible storehouse of the Eastern tales of wonder, which the Arabian Nights is only the most famous. There's an even larger collection called The Ocean of the Streams of Story, which was a name I afterwards stole for another book. So you grow up with that as your heritage, and then all around you have the Bombay movie industry, and that's another kind of surrealism. And then there's a very strong oral tradition of narrative, which is interesting because the oral storytellers tell stories in a very jumbled, looping way, where they will mingle autobiography, political anecdote, mythology, song, jokes. It's full of 5 or 6 different kinds of narrative weaving in and out of each other, like a juggling act. And I thought, that's really interesting because it's the opposite of what you're supposed to do.
Yes.
And yet it keeps people sitting there mesmerized if you do it right. And Midnight's Children kind of grew out of that. But it's true that I also have always been very attracted to what one might broadly call the surrealist or fantastic tradition in world literature. I think you find it every so often everywhere. Whether it's Calvino in Italy, or Gogol and Bulgakov in Russia, or Borges and Garcia Marquez in Latin America, there it is. And I think that recurring way of writing always attracted me.
But you are using this way of writing also to investigate your own identity, to investigate the condition of being a migrant and roots, and also the political history, particularly of the Indian subcontinent.
Well, it began with the Indian subcontinent, yes, because I thought, that I should start with where I came from. And yes, Midnight's Children and Shame were both attempts to grapple with that reality.
So let's come now directly to the Satanic Verses, because one of the things that was said about the Satanic Verses by some of your critics, he must have known what he was doing. He knew what he was getting himself into.
Well, Act 1 was to try and understand where I came from, and then I thought Act 2 would be to try and understand what had happened to me. And the most obvious thing that happened to me was that I had migrated to live in England. So that phenomenon of migration became something I wanted to explore. what it does to the individual, what it does to the spirit, how you deal with the fact that you leave behind the culture you know, you leave behind the language you're familiar with, you leave behind the community that knows you, and you leave behind very often the belief systems and so on. And the individual self is put in question. You have to re-examine all these things. And so I thought the novel that I wanted to write would be an act of putting in question the nature of a migrant.
And indeed you have a character like Chamcha who's trying to be more English than he really is. You investigate all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, the novel is about two actors, both of whom are in different ways damaged by the journey. Chamcha is, the word chamcha in India idiomatically means kind of somebody who sucks up to somebody, or a toady.
Yes.
And the other character, Jibril, is basically slowly losing his mind and has lost his faith, which is the thing which has precipitated the mental crisis. So these two performers fall to earth in London, and their story becomes my way of investigating that world I wanted to look
Again,
at.
investigating identity. And the most controversial parts of this are a dream sequence.
Yeah. I mean, this is the character Jibril who has lost his faith. And as a consequence of this, he is plagued by these serial dreams about the creation of a religion in a place not called Makkah or Medina, with a prophet not called Muhammad, who creates a religion not called Islam. But obviously there are direct parallels intentionally with the birth of
Did you
Islam.
think when you were writing this, this is edgy, this is difficult, this is edgy, some people may be offended?
Yeah.
You thought all of that?
No question. I mean, I there's no question that I thought, I thought I'd made enough distancing devices. As I say, those not called things, but also the fact that it's in a dream sequence and it's a dream of a man who's losing his mind because of his loss of faith. I thought that's what we call fiction in the trade. And I thought that was probably enough distancing, which it clearly wasn't. But I also thought that, yes, people of orthodox and conservative religious belief wouldn't care for it. And my view is then they should read another book.
But you finish the book, and there are rumbles quite early on,
yes.
Particularly in India itself, to start with.
At that time, the Rajiv Gandhi government was pretty weak electorally and wanted to woo what it thought of as the Muslim vote. And so it didn't ban the book exactly. It did something more Indian and easier, which is to prevent its import under the Customs Act.
Right. Meanwhile, this text is flying into a political world where you have Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi Sunni version of Islam and the Iranian Shiite leaders in competition about who are going to be the big guys leading militant Islam in the modern world.
Yes. Remember that I'm not a person from that part of the world, so I know much more about it now than I did then, But at that time, the world of Saudi Wahhabi Islam and Shia Khomeiniite Islam was pretty remote from me. And there is a page or two in the Satanic Verses where there's a character who's a sort of version of the Imam. I think my guess is that he never saw a copy of the book. He saw some stories on television about demonstrations in India and Pakistan, and thought he could jump on the bandwagon. I mean, he was looking for a vehicle because the Iran's Iraq War, had ended very badly for Iran, and many young people had died to no purpose, and he was looking for a way of reinvigorating the revolution, and unfortunately, it turned out to be me.
Let's just remind listeners of how big the story was at the time and how the rest of us first heard about it.
Iran's spiritual leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, has told Muslims that the prize-winning author Salman Rushdie must be killed on sight. His book, Satanic Verses, is an insult to Islam.
The Ayatollah Khomeini this morning sanctioned the death of the author Salman Rushdie and all those who helped him publish the book, The Satanic Verses.
The public burning of the book on the streets of Britain has shown that the fact that it's fiction makes no difference to those whose leaders have pronounced it blasphemous.
I don't agree with the Ayatollah saying that he must die, but can see why he makes such a statement. Because somebody who is blaspheming and somebody who was born a Muslim, okay, and if you then reject Islam, then you are a renegade.
He must be killed. He tortured the Muslim community. Killing him is honor for me. For any good Muslim, any practicing Muslim, killing him is honor.
So this is a terrifying moment, the like of which no Western writer had experienced before.
You know, it was very hard to know at that point what the news meant, whether this was just a rhetorical flourish or a real menace. And
your friend Martin Amis had that great phrase, you disappeared into the headlines or into the front pages.
Yeah, disappeared into the front page, yeah.
That's right.
I mean, I think that's what then happened to me, yes.
You are picked up by a world of armed agents.
Yeah, well, initially, see, everybody, politicians, police force, myself, believed this would be sorted out in a couple of days because it was so outrageous that it couldn't be allowed to stand. You know, the leader of a foreign power should threaten with murder a British citizen who had committed no crime in his own country and demand that killers go and carry out the sentence. I mean, crazy. Couldn't be allowed to happen. And the police said to me, just choose somewhere you want to go to lie low for a couple of days and just let the politicians sort it out.
And instead of a couple of days, it was 10 years.
It was, 10 and a bit, yeah.
10 and a bit.
Yeah. And then I was told that I couldn't go home. I mean, there was this sort of story around those days that I was offered this endless sequence of government safe houses. Well, if there were such things, I never saw them. It was always made clear to me that it was my business to find places to live, except that I couldn't live in the place that I actually owned. And it was just a constant nightmare.
And so you now embark on a long period where you are living all the time with police officers. Mm-hmm. It's quite an intimate form of imprisonment, in a sense.
Well, it was usually 4, 2 protection officers and 2 drivers. I had to rent houses which could accommodate. I had to rent essentially a 4-bedroom house for the police before I had a room of my own. And not just that, but it couldn't be a terraced house. It couldn't be a house with a visible entry and exit point. You know, those had to be concealed. It would be better if it was freestanding in its own grounds with gates. And then sometimes I would pay 6 months rental for these places, and about 3 weeks later they'd say, "Oh, well, the house has been blown. You can't go there anymore." And I'd have to rent another place and throw away all that money. But quite often, I was in relatively small spaces, and that meant that we were all pushed together quite a lot. And I think it was very difficult for them, because these are men of action, not used to being still and secret. And because, the normal protection that's offered in this country is not concealment. They simply escort people where they need to go. Yes. And they would often say to me that this isn't what they were trained to do. That
this is hanging around.
Yeah, they were trained to protect, not to conceal. And so I think that hanging around was beyond tedious and difficult for them.
Yes.
Well, me too.
It was also very difficult for your own relationships.
Yes.
Your relationship with your son, which is a constant theme through this book, trying to explain to him when he's very young what's going on and trying to stay close to him, but also your relationship with different women. Marianne Wiggins, then your wife, you and she broke up pretty angrily, and you're pretty angry about her, I think, still in the book. Difficult when you're writing something as intimate as this to know where to draw the line sometimes, I suspect.
Very difficult. I mean, I have to say that since she gave an extremely unpleasant interview in the Sunday Times, the front page at that time, I haven't spoken about it for 20 years. I think I'm allowed to have my say. But the truth is, I didn't want to write this book to settle scores or to get even, and that was a very firm starting point. I wanted to be fair to people. I could see that the pressure of events was such that she wanted to get away from it, didn't feel that she wanted to be part of it. Yes, not good for a private life or a public life. I mean, it was very difficult for me to work.
The memoir is called Joseph Anton. Why?
Well, it was a thing that cropped up within a few moments of the police protection beginning, when it became clear that I would need a pseudonym. So they asked me to think of one, and then they said, don't use an Indian name because that'll be too obvious. So this is a very strange thing, to be asked to surrender your name and also give up the ethnicity of your name. And so I thought, well, if I have to surrender ethnicity, I'll retreat into literature. And eventually settled on a name which was concocted from the first names of Conrad and Chekhov. So it became Joseph Anton. You know, I had checkbooks issued in that name. My bank manager was in on the secret. That was it. That's how life is.
So you were Joseph Anton?
Yes, and I could write checks in that. I could rent properties in that. So it became my name. I hated it.
One of the things that will surprise people when they pick this book up and start to read it is that you've written it in the third person. Mm-hmm. Why was that?
Because when I tried to write it in the first person, I didn't like it. You know, this happened to me. It just felt, I thought, stop it, shut up. You know, it felt narcissistic.
Step to one side.
And I had this idea that I wanted to write it like a novel. I wanted to write it like, you know, a non-fiction novel, in the way of The Right Stuff or Schindler's Ark. Except the difference here was that I wasn't writing about somebody else's life, I was writing about mine. And so I thought, how about if I just step one step to the left and write about the character with my name? And the moment I started doing it, it was like an open sesame. It was a sort of light bulb moment. I thought, oh, okay, now I know how to write it.
I want to come to what is the most painful moment, probably, in the entire book, which is when you are persuaded that if you meet Muslim community leaders in London, and it happens in the bowels of Paddington Green Police Station.
Yeah, where they held the IRA.
And you talk to them, you can somehow get yourself off the hook.
Mm-hmm. This was somewhere in late 1990, so things had been bad for over a year and a half at this point, with no end in view. And with an enormous storm of abuse raining down on my head, and a kind of growing opinion, not only amongst Muslims, that this was my fault and I'd better do something to fix it. And that had its effect on me. It was very debilitating. And I think I was in a very black place at the time, very despairing. And then I was offered what seemed to be an olive branch. The idea was that they would throw their weight behind, you know, a lifting of the threats and so on and so on, if I made certain mollifying remarks.
Which included a declaration that you were a Muslim.
Well, you see, initially I didn't think it did include that. Initially I thought that I could make a declaration of being a part of the culture of Islam without being necessarily a believer, in the way that you could have, you know, secular Jews and so on. And instead I got there with this tribunal sitting at a long table and, you know, waving a piece of paper for me to sign. And I just think my despair was so great that I signed it. I use a line somewhere in the book about how, you know, the fish feels the hook and continues to bite.
Yes. But you know immediately that you've done something wrong.
Yeah, as did most of the people close to me, I have to say, starting with my sister.
Yes, they felt you'd folded or you'd crumbled to the crucial
she called
point.
me up, she said, have you gone mad? And I think she wasn't far off, actually, you know, in terms of the level of my sanity at that point. But I think it was beneficial to me. It was a turning point for me, because I think the thing about hitting bottom, you know, and having to really reckon with yourself and tell yourself you've done something beyond stupid, something really compromising, something that destroys your credibility, so on. All of which I thought, the first thing you think is, I'm never doing that again.
Yeah.
And it just gave me the strength to begin to fight back. I think really that moment of hitting the bottom. And of course, they betrayed everything they'd said they'd do. You know, there was absolute
nothing followed from it.
Nothing followed from it except accusations and contempt. So even as a tactic, it was pretty pathetic. But yeah, that gave me the strength to say, okay, now we're not going to compromise. We're not going to surrender. We're not going to give in here. We're going to fight.
There are two main lines of attack, apart from the Islamists being made on you all the way through. One is the political thing. here is a lefty writer who's been rude about Margaret Thatcher, and the British government and the British taxpayer are protecting him. Why can't he be, I don't know, more grateful?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, I was grateful all the time. I was constantly telling people how grateful I was. But, if you don't want to hear that, you don't hear it. If you want to attack somebody for not being grateful, it's inconvenient if they're constantly grateful. Of course I was grateful. There were men risking their lives.
Yes.
To protect mine.
Because I suppose the other part of that is in the publishing industry, a lot of people do die. I mean, particularly in a bomb attack aimed at one of your translators. Another of your translators is murdered. There's a very near thing in Norway as well, around the world. So lots of people are out there risking themselves for this book. I
mean, yes, this was a real threat to a lot of people, and I think there was a sort of feeling around that maybe I was exaggerating it, that because I hadn't been killed, nobody was trying to kill me, and that I was just sort of blowing it up because I liked having the armoured jags.
How did you manage to carry on writing? Because you produced a stream of novels and indeed children's books as well during this period. And I've always wondered, because you were living in this rather airless world. I mean, you were closed. You couldn't wander the streets and you couldn't go to India. And I
guess this, writers are fortunate in that we have interior lives, and that we're able to enter those worlds and live in that way. I started because I had made a promise to my son Zafar that I would write a book for him. And it was good that I had made it, because there was a kind of despair engulfing me about my writing at the time. And that promise forced me back to the desk. And in the end, when I found the way of writing what became Haroun and the Sea of Stories, it was a joyful book. It's odd that in this very, very dark time of my life, I wrote what may be the most joyful book I've ever written. And it gave me back some joy, and it gave me back a sense of loving the work that I did.
And in terms of the fight that you were engaged in, were you also highly conscious of the fact that if you stopped writing, if you are unable to produce novels, they would have won?
Yeah, I kept telling myself, like a kind of mantra, I would say, if people are trying to shut you up, shout louder. If people are trying to silence your writing, write better. Don't allow yourself to become the creature of the event.
Well, one of the books that you produced, Luca and the Fire of Life, again written for children. This is about the most direct thing that you write, I think, during this period, about your own position. The key characters go into the land of rats.
Yes.
And these are rats who are very easily offended.
They're thin-skinned.
They're very thin-skinned rats. And if I could ask you just to read from there on.
They came through the border post and found themselves in a grey street. The houses, the curtains at the windows, the clothing worn by rats and people alike. Yes, there were people here, Luca was relieved to see. All grey. The rats were grey too, and the people had acquired a greyish pallor. Overhead grey clouds allowed a neutral sunlight to filter through. They developed a colour problem here a little while ago, Nobu Daddy said. The rats, who hated the colour yellow because of its, cheesiness, were confronted by the rats who disliked the colour red because of its similarity to blood. In the end, all colours, being offensive to someone or the other, were banned.
And it's pretty clear, the world that you're describing there. I'd like to turn to the effect of what happened to you, because your story goes on and eventually if the fatwa sort of dies away, yes, you're able to re-emerge, you're able to live a public life, particularly in America, yes, which becomes your real home. But we are left in a world where some rats don't like one colour, some rats don't like another colour, and this book, The Satanic Verses, would not be published by anybody today if it was taken by a young author to any publishing house, would it?
Yeah, I think that's a question that I've asked myself a lot, and the book tries to ask itself towards the end, but whether we should describe this as a victory or a defeat.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, if you look at the kind of narrow story of my own circumstances, that there was an attempt to suppress a book which was not suppressed, and which is still freely available in whatever it is, 50 languages or something. And there was an attempt to suppress the author of the book, who is also not suppressed because he's here talking to you.
And indeed, you've actually come across some of the people who were burning your book in the streets, who later read it.
Yes, and who couldn't see what the fuss was about, even though they were the people making the fuss. I also think it was interesting a few years ago, on the 20th anniversary of the fatwa, that here in England there was a certain amount of coverage of that anniversary, and quite a lot of the people who had been involved in the protests accepted that they had been a mistake, that it had been wrong to do that. Some of them thought so for purely tactical reasons. Some of them said, well, it backfired and it increased hostility towards the community. And as for Rushdie, all it did was make him more famous and more money. So we shouldn't have done it. So some of them had that kind of tactical sense of why it had been wrong, but others had, in a way, accepted the free speech argument and understood that if they were going to say what they wanted, that other people who disagreed with them should be able to do that too.
And so that is the limited victory argument.
Yes.
But against that, self-censorship quite clearly has spread almost everywhere.
Absolutely. I think that's quite right, that there is a very striking, chilling effect. I would say more in the industry than amongst the writers. I think writers basically in the end are pretty bloody-minded people and will write what they have to write. But you're right about finding publishers, persuading bookstores to stock the books, and in the case of theatre, persuading theatres to put it on. I think that in that way there actually is a problem that has by no means gone away and is by no means confined to this country. And I think one of the things that is quite worrying to me about what's happening in India is the way in which religious extremists of all stripes, Hindus as well as Muslims, have in a way been inspired to start attacking works of art all the time, whether books or paintings or indeed works of scholarship.
Do you think if you had never written the Satanic Verses, if your search to understand your own identity and the world around you had led you in a slightly different direction, do you think all this would have happened anyway? That this happens to be the little bit of flame that set up?
I don't know. Well, I don't flatter myself that I could take responsibility for the whole of history. That was...
Sure, but there's a specific series of events which one follows on.
Yeah, I think this was a step along that road. But if you think about what happened in those years of the fatwa, in Egypt, the very eminent secularist thinker Farag Foda was murdered by Islamic radicals. In Algeria, this celebrated novelist Tahir Joud was murdered by Islamic radicals. So this isn't a one-off thing.
And we haven't talked about the Danish cartoons or Ian Hirson Ali and Theo van Gogh.
Yeah, so we have what we see, as time passed, and it became easier to see the case of the Satanic Verses in a larger context. We saw that there is a pretty serious attempt to attack intellectual freedoms in many parts of this world, of the Muslim world. And as I say, then spreading in India into other religions. So,
well, and when we say it carries on now, at the Jaipur Literary Festival, recently, you were not allowed to attend. The book is still banned there, and I think we can hear Alan Yentob has made a film about all of this for Imagine. And one of the people he spoke to, Harry Kunzru, recalls deciding to read parts of the Satanic Verses at that festival as a protest.
It felt inadequate just to make a statement of support or sympathy. We had to do something that would be a concrete exercise of free speech. We decided to read from the book The Satanic Verses. Question: what is the opposite of faith? Not disbelief, too final, certain, closed, itself a kind of belief. Doubt, the human condition. But what of the angelic, halfway between Allah God and Homo sap? Did they ever doubt? They did. Challenging God's will one day, they hid, muttering beneath the throne, daring to ask forbidden things. Anti-questions. Is it right that? Could it not be argued? Freedom, the old anti-quest.
The book is effectively banned in India. Hari Kunzru downloaded the passages he read from the internet.
What then happened?
All hell broke loose. We had the cops turning up, we had mullahs and the political establishment on the phone to the organisers.
What happens to the life of the mind if writers and publishers pull back because they are frankly scared?
Well, it dies a little. That's what happens, because the imagination only works when it's free. There's no way of dreaming in chains. And we are a dreaming creature. And we are a creature that expresses those dreams in language. We're also a language creature. And so it's very important that we be allowed the freedom of our own human nature. This is not specific to this culture or that culture. This is what we are as a species.
And so what do you say to those people who say, yes, but in the multicultural world of the modern West, we are all tiptoeing ahead, feeling our way with our fingers in this new world, and we have to show special sensitivity, particularly to people who are at the bottom of the pile, don't feel welcome, as you yourself didn't feel welcome in a different context when you first came to this country?
Well, I have sort of rude four-letter word to say about that on the whole, because it seems to be, I'm part of that generation which began to talk about multiculturalism for the first time and indeed to celebrate it. And it's quite clear to me that at one level we can't argue with the fact that we live in a multiculture. We do no longer live in a monoculture. And it's the same as, you may dislike globalization, but the world is not going to deglobalize. This is just what there is, and deal with it. So I think there's much to celebrate about these engagements of cultures with each other that happen in our city streets every day. I think we are enriched by them. But what has developed, in this country and in others, is kind of multiculturalism's evil twin, which is cultural relativism, where you start trying to excuse people from particular groups for behavior which you would condemn other groups for, because, hey, it's their culture. I think the question is this: you have to have, as a culture as a whole, you do have to have a sense of what your values are, and I find myself arguing increasingly an old battle which I thought was won, which is the idea of the universality of human rights. There is an attempt by always extraordinarily conservative, quasi-totalitarian thinkers to say that the universality of human rights is a Western colonial construct imposed on the rest of the world. It's always tyrants who say that. But I think we need to argue for the fact that we do all, as human beings, have certain inalienable rights.
And they include the right to genuine free speech and free thought?
They do. It's true everywhere in the world. Whenever it's silenced, whenever people sit on it, it's the thing people most want back. When you lose it, it's what you need most. That's when you realize it. And I think I found this. When you live in a society in which you, broadly speaking, have freedom of speech, you don't have to make a big song and dance about it. When somebody starts, as they started with me, trying to turn that freedom off, to turn off the air supply, you rather rapidly discover that it's important to state that you need air to breathe. You need to be able to say your piece.
And that is why when someone says to you, I think at one point in the memoir, what about your regrets? What is the biggest regret? When it comes to the book itself, you say, I should have been ruder. I should have been clearer.
I said, I wish I'd written a more critical book. And the fact is that I don't think of it as a very critical book. The book, The Satanic Verses, says that religion, that any new idea that is born, in this case a religion, has to answer two great questions. One is, how do you behave when you're weak? And the other is, how do you behave when you're strong? And in the case of the birth of Islam and the fictional religion in the book, the answer to the first question is that, yes, there was perhaps a flirtation with compromise, which is the so-called incident of the Satanic Verses.
This is where the prophet comes down with some verses which turn out later to have been told to him by satanic
by the devil instead of the archangel.
Yes.
But these were verses in which he flirted with the compromise of accepting the semi-divine status of three popular pagan goddesses in Makkah. It's a recorded incident. it's clear that he flirted with it and then rejected it. So how do you behave when you're weak? Yes, okay, you flirt with every prophet in the whole history of prophecy has the moment of temptation. Every prophet in the Old Testament and New Testament, there it is. Yeah. This was Islam's moment of temptation. He overcomes temptation and sticks to his guns. Monotheism, in other words. How do you behave when you're strong? When he enters Makkah in triumph later in his career, all his enemies at his feet, he's remarkably merciful. There's no mass slaughters. A couple of writers get killed. Didn't like satirists. No. So that's there at the beginning too. But on the whole, it's an impressive answer to the two big questions. And when I was writing the book, I had no real sense that I was attacking him. I thought I was presenting him as a human being, which is what he always said he was.
And so, is it therefore the moment when the West has to stand up and give no quarter to censorship?
One has to divide this into two parts. One is that on the question of morals, values and freedoms, I think we do have to stand very firm. On the question of how we treat our fellow citizens and the people we live with in the street, that's a different question. I think they have a right to expect courtesy and tolerance and to be treated fairly.
Free speech doesn't mean going into a bar and screaming abuse at people.
Free speech doesn't mean beating up people who are not like you. So I think the question of the mind and the expression of the mind in speech, that's extremely important that be protected. But it's also extremely important that people be protected from abuse and vilification, including me, by the way.
The man who is not Joseph Anton.
Yeah.
Salman Rushdie, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Your autobiography, Joseph Anton, is Book of the Week on Radio 4. And Imagine, the Fatwa Salman story, is on BBC One this Wednesday at 10:35 p.m. Next week, Myths and Fairy Tales with Philip Pullman, Sarah Maitland and Keith Warner. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
A year before I was born, they were originally of Kashmiri extraction, although my father was from an old Delhi family. Mm-hmm. My mother and he initially lived there and then decided, as partition was approaching, that they didn't want to go to Pakistan. They were not religious. They didn't want to live in a religious state. They felt more Indian than Muslim, and so they thought they'd go to Bombay, which had a reputation, justifiably, as a place where communal violence did not happen. And I was born there a year later.
So the themes of religion and violence and so on were there from the start. You have been obsessed throughout your fiction by names, and mixing names up. And indeed, your own name, Rushdie, is a made-up name. It's a name that your father essentially invented. Salman Rushdie's life changed instantly and forever. Over the next decade, he was on the run or in hiding, guarded by armed officers as assassins tried to hunt him down. He lived, he survived, he carried on writing, but he has not, until now, addressed directly the nightmare which overtook him. This story is very far from over. The effect of what has happened has had a big impact on free speech. Salman Rushdie's memoir is called Joseph Anton, and we'll explain why later. But let's start, Salman Rushdie, about talking about who you are, where you come from. You come from a most unusual family in India, in Bombay.
Yes, my parents moved to Bombay, in fact, just before I was...
As a homage to the philosopher Ibn Rushd.
Yes, well, Ibn Rushd, known in the European tradition as Averroes, was the great translator and critic of Aristotle. And in many ways, the reason we have a lot of Aristotle is because of his Arabic translations, because a lot of the original Greek was lost and he was retranslated. Anyway, he was also a remarkable figure in medieval Islam, in the Spanish part of the Muslim Empire at that time, because he was a very progressive force. He was one of the people who was trying to break the power of the literalists, the people who said that the Quran could not be interpreted, could only be read literally.
So what a name to be under. And there's a wonderful passage which I'm going to ask you to read from your memoir.
At least.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello and welcome back for Start the Week's autumn season. We begin with a special, a single guest and one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of modern letters. On Valentine's Day 1989, at the funeral of the writer Bruce Chatwin in London, word spread about something almost unbelievable. Iran's spiritual leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, had just ordered the murder of one of the guests, Salman Rushdie, for the crime of writing a novel, The Satanic Verses, which, despite being a fantasy fiction, Khomeini considered blasphemous.
He told himself when the storm broke over his head, "I'm going into this battle bearing the right name." From beyond the grave his father had given him the flag under which he was ready to fight, the flag of Ibn Rushd, which stood for intellect, argument, analysis and progress, for the freedom of philosophy and learning from the shackles of theology, for human reason and against blind faith, submission, acceptance and stagnation.
So you come from this free-thinking, rather rebelliously, intellectually rebellious Bombay background.
Yes.
But early on, you are sent away to school, rugby school, and the snow, and there's an almost kind of Greyfriars world. I mean, at that stage, it's a pretty harsh and alienating and an odd world for an Indian boy to arrive in.